Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat network. Our topic of discussion today, friends, is relatively new and developing field of environmental history, and today's and tomorrow's lecture shall form an introduction to all of you. And for this discussion and lecture, we have thus in our studio Dr. Meyankom Kumuyu, Associate Professor, Hi. Department of History, Satьяваті College, Evening University of Delhi. Dr. Kumuyu has a teaching experience of 20 years and he has contributed significantly also to the course writing program for the distant education mode at IGNOU, New Delhi. Also, friends, I would like to tell you that Dr. Kumuyu is a recipient of the UGC's Research Award 2012-14. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome sir. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you, Urvashi, and good afternoon to everybody. Today's topic which I have chosen is basically environmental history. It's a new emerging field in the larger domain of historical sciences. My concern today and tomorrow will be to introduce what we mean by environmental history. More importantly, why is it important to study environmental history? Before I begin and delve into the nature of environmental history, let me quote few things for you. And what is more important for us, that environmental history should not be confused with the history of environment. Why I say so? There are reasons. Usually whenever we say environment, people take for granted everything on the globe is being discussed. Environmental history is not history of environment. These are two different things. And we must understand why it is important to distinguish between environmental history and history of environment. History of environment, how environment has evolved, how earth has evolved, how earth has taken shape, how earth has been forming, what is the role of climate, how climate has evolved, how human life has evolved, how life per se has evolved, which means whatever is part of environment, the history of that is history of environment, and that is usually dealt by other specialists. For example, geologists take care of geological history of the earth, paleobotanists, botanists, they take care of the evolution of flora, fauna, then the zoologists, they take care of the evolution of animals. At the moment, I will be focusing on history of environment in a sense when humans started interacting with it. History per se is interaction with human interaction with the nature, or when human came into being, the part of history is basically called history. When we start getting written form or the written documents, the written evidence are available, that is classically called history. Anything prior to availability of written record is either proto-history or prehistory. Prehistory, we study prehistory on the basis of archaeological tools, archaeological remains. The period for which human past is important in this context, that history is basically human past. The period for which written history is not available is basically prehistory. Proto-history, for example, is Harappan period, when we have the record but not yet deciphered that. Proto-history is transition between prehistory and history. So when we say environmental history, we are primarily focusing on period for which we have written records. This should be very clear when we discuss environmental history. Otherwise, people tend to blur the line between history of environment and environmental history. This is all the more important when we start examining any climatic factor which has been influencing humans, or geographical formation which has been influencing humans, that has its own history, but that is not part of environmental history. When we say environmental history, we primarily mean humans' interaction, the written part of human past which has been documented historically. So we are basically focusing on environmental history. Let me also elaborate what we mean by history of environment. Geological history of the earth, the beginning of earth, the formation of earth, then the current shape which is visible to us, how it has evolved, the continental drift and related history is also part of history of environment. It is the geologists who deal with this. Our concern, at times we go back at times we go back to this part of history as well, but that is not classically what we terminate as environmental history. For example, various kinds of animals are available, visible in different parts of globe at the moment. But when this whole land mass was one, then what was the distribution? How it distributed into Africa, America, Asia, etc., etc. So at times environmental history lead us back to the part of history where these factors are examined. But primarily we focus when humans have the period for which humans have been existing on earth. Nothing prior to that is not part of classical environmental history. More important, for example, the emergence of Himalayas, the formation of mountains. It has history, but that is not part of environmental history. But how Himalaya has been influencing human habitation, human settlement, that is part of environmental history. In what ways Himalayan has been forming a barrier for the subcontinent of India, that is important consideration when we examine settlement pattern in Indian subcontinent, or when we examine the Tibet plateau and the areas beyond that. Then Himalaya history of Himalaya plays an important role, but that is not primary consideration of environmental historian. We tend to focus on the part when humans were in existence. Similarly, the rivers have formed, but rivers have been changing their course. At one level we try to document that, but that document, when we as an environmental historians examine, then we tend to examine how that change in the course of river has been influencing human settlement. Anything prior to existence of human is part of history of environment of that river. We are not focusing on that. We cannot, because as a historian our tools are primarily written records, at times archaeological evidences, but those archaeological evidences which relate to humans. To further elaborate that, let me quote another a quote from the editor of a famous journal, Environment and History, John M. Mackenzie. John M. Mackenzie, he says, I will be reading this, it will be available on your screen. The words environment and ecology have been subjected to extensive efforts at definition during the past 20 years or so. He wrote this in a decade back, which means for 30 years we have been trying to define the term environment and ecology. Already it has proved necessary to allow them to space to breathe areas of development of any discipline. So it is also with environmental history or environment and history. As with most commitments, it is possible to have hard and soft positions. The hard might suggest that environmental history necessarily involves an examination of environmental dynamics through human agency in which the change is quantifiable in some shape or form. I will be elaborating this aspect later on also. A softer approach should suggest perhaps that change could be inferred from even where data are not available, indirect evidence of that impact of that change. Interactions with environment may also be frozen in narrow time scale where change is less significant, but that is also concern of environmental historians. Relevant sections of legislation are also part of environmental history. How contemporary society or societies of past have been treating, visualizing in terms of as a policy matter, that is also concern of environmental historian. Why I am stressing these two positions, hard and soft? To tell you that on the one hand we distinguish between history of environment and environmental history. On the other hand, we also tend to suggest that history of environment cannot be segregated from the environmental history, though we will be focusing primarily on human past of environment, but the past which existed prior to humans is also at times considered by the environmental historians. Let me take another example, the climatic history of the world. Most of the people must be aware the Ice Age, interglacial period, etc. There are several movies on Ice Age in the cartoon section of Hollywood. Ice Age, an age which precedes existence of humans. How Ice Age and interglacial period means the period between two ice ages. It has been suggested that that ice age has been following a cyclic pattern: ice age, then interglacial period, then ice age, then interglacial period. At the moment we are living in one of the interglacial period. It is not ice age, and some scientists argue that sooner we will be moving towards another ice age. I am not going into details simply because I am not competent to comment on that. It is a scientific debate. But for me, what is important is that human existence, the way we understand today, is basically part of this interglacial period, the present interglacial period. The beginning of agriculture took place during this period. Later on, urbanization came during this interglacial period. Industrialization and the contemporary society, all this is part of this interglacial period. So we are in a way studying interglacial period. We are also studying impacts of ice age, but that is not the primary concern. How humans have been interacting with during this interglacial period, that has been our focus. Why that is important for us to understand? During interglacial period, the climate has changed. That changed climate also resulted several kinds of modification in the landscape. The landscape which now can sustain agriculture. The landscape which sustains variety of flora, variety of fauna, which means we are using the data of climate which is available for ice age, contrasting it with the interglacial period, and then trying to examine in what ways this has been playing a very influential role in evolution of human settlements in various parts of the globe. Let me give you a concrete example. When we look at India, the history of monsoon. It is very important for us to understand history of monsoon, not only for the sake of how societies have evolved, but also how future is going to take shape. So history of monsoon is important consideration for us as environmental historians, but the kind of tools which we have does not allow us to go beyond a period for which there are other kinds of tools to be utilized. Climate historians, they have been using historical data for future projections. IPCC, they extensively document the past climatic pattern and then they project the future climatic pattern. Excuse me. This is very important. In France, when scientists were working on interglacial period, the coming of little ice age, etc., the climatologist invited historians. Ladurie, the famous annals historian, Ladurie wrote that they invited us to verify their finding. Their findings are basically based on various kind of scientific evidences, but those scientific evidence, are they valid for the result which they have been proposing? For that, historians were invited, and historians, on the basis of historical evidences of that period, when they corroborated, yes, this is what was happening during that period of time, when we study the historical period, when we study the crop pattern, when we study the impact on various kind of fruits during that period of time, how production fell or how production rise. All these factors were studied by historians, and then climatologists were able to verify their theory on climatic changes. So in a way, the environmental historians and history of environment, they both have been playing complementary role. There are limitations for the working of history of environment scientists, and there are limitations for environmental historians as well. This becomes all the more glaring. When we examine climatic fluctuations, climatic changes in very tiny time scale, because historical tools, they have been basically using tree rings and the components of sea beds, the components of lake beds, what kind of pollination is visible in the seabed and in the ocean beds. But they usually work on very large time scale. It is the historian which can work on a smaller time scale. So to verify their long term evidences, they usually try to substantiate their findings with the help of historical tools, which means the history of climate as environmental history as environmental historian examines, and history of climate as climatologists examine. They both are trying to understand the character of monsoon or character of climate, but how that climate has influenced human society is analyzed by environmental historians, and how that has been functioning over centuries, over generations, that is being taken care by climatologists. Further, climatologists use this data, use this evidence to propose what kind of changes are possible. Given these tendencies, these possibilities, these probabilities, this is what is expected in coming 20 years, coming 50 years, coming 100 years. Similarly, when we examine ice age or interglacial period, how during the ice age, how ice was extending its domain in various parts of globe, and how its retreat has enabled a different kind of flora fauna, which means if we are able to document these changes, then we will be able to adapt to changes which might take place in future. Usually, this is done by climatologists or those geologists who are working on ice age. But as a historians, we have been doing that for a little ice age which was witnessed in Europe in late 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. That little ice age is fortunately historically available to us. We have documents how humans negotiated with that. In what ways? Expansion of ice sheet led to withdrawal of settlement from the base of mountain towards greater plains. Later on, with the retreat of ice age, with the retreat of ice sheet, how the landscape was changed, disturbed, modified, and humans were able to use that in a modified manner. So, these changes have been documented by environmental historians. In what ways population was affected, in what ways production was affected, how that production affected the overall well-being of society, how that change in agrarian production influenced the subsistence pattern, what other methods of sustenance were evolved by the humans. All this is being documented to corroborate the findings proposed by climatologists or those geologists who are working on ice age, that look, with the coming of ice age, these are the possibilities, and with the withdrawal of ice age, these are the possibilities. And this is how humans have been historically negating or adapting to these kind of changes. Similarly, if you move towards the beginning of life on earth in ocean, the beginning of life on earth flora, the beginning of life on earth in terms of fauna, mass extinctions, which means there has been life on earth from the period much before humans came into existence. Initially, the life was in oceans, then it shifted to land, not shifted, then it also spread to land, and then avian life is visible to us. All these changes are being documented by respective specialists. We are not going to deal with that. We cannot. For example, what I am stressing on this point is there have been several mass extinction. Mass extinction means the elimination of large section of flora or fauna from earth for whatever reason. The classic example is the age of dinosaurs, mass extinction of dinosaurs. Humans were not even in existence during that period of time, yet mass existence took place, which means those who argue that humans are responsible for mass extinction must be aware that nature itself has been functioning in a manner where mass extinction has been taking place. I am not denying the role of humans in the future possibility of mass extinction. The way we are reducing our biodiversity and the role of humans in that cannot be undermined. Nobody can undermine that. But we must remember that nature itself has been functioning in a manner through which there have been several mass extinctions. With mass extinction, one variety of species or several variety of species have wiped out from the earth and new varieties have emerged. This continuity is very important for historians to negotiate, to understand. Because this continuity helps them understand that even on a smaller time scale, there have been changes in flora fauna or in the way humans have been interacting with the flora fauna. So, the larger concern of evolution of life on earth, the larger concern of evolution of various varieties of fauna or later on of flora or later on fauna, all this is at the backdrop of environmental historians, that we must be aware that these changes have been taking place, and though these changes are very slow, very slow in terms, if you compare it with the historical changes, then these geological changes are very slow, but they have been taking place and they might take place during present contemporary time as well. So, as an environmental historian, we have to be aware that the climate, nature, earth, life, flora, fauna, all this has been in transition. If you can recall one of my earlier lecture which I delivered here, I was arguing in terms of stationarity, that as a social scientist we need to realize that life is not static, the society is not static, it has been moving, it has been changing. So, as a historians, we need to understand the changes which has been taking place much before humans came into existence, but they have been influencing human existence. That is what we must understand when we understand environmental history. We must distinguish these two, the history of environment or environmental history. Please put the slide. Why I am stressing this point, let me once again argue that none of this is not concern of environmental history. I am not suggesting that. I am simply suggesting that environmental history, the classical environmental historian does not have tool to examine these in detail. We do not have that tool. What we can understand, how this has been visualized by contemporary society and how are we preparing for the future changes. Now, let me come back to the classical environmental history, what we mean by environmental history, and how environmental history has been taking shape in the last, primarily last 50 years, but it has a long history. Richard Grove, in one of the very famous article, a two-part classical article, the title of the article is Imperialism, Intellectual Networks and Environmental Change, Origins and Evolution of Environmental History from 1676 to 2000. This article is very important for anybody who is working on environmental history, simply because Richard Grove and V. Damodaran were able to suggest that the present day environmental history has been influenced by these changes. Let me quote from that article and then we will be elaborating on that. The intellectual origins of environmental history as a self-conscious domain of inquiry can be traced to the encounter of 17th and 18th century Western Europeans with the startlingly unfamiliar environments of the tropics and the damage inflicted on these environments in the course of resource extraction by European empires. For nearly a century, from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, the discipline developed primarily in the form of historical geography, which means we can trace back environmental history to historical geography. Why I am suggesting this? Simply because to make you understand that gradually in historical understandings, we have been moving from history of kings to history of societies, to history of economies, history of marginal sections of society and the marginal areas of investigation, and then the history of environment as well, the environmental history, the history of environmental factor in influencing human history, which means now historians have expanded their domain. The center of study, the center of investigation in any study is now taking care of geographical factor, the role and influences of geography, the role and influences of environment in shaping the character of human society. But This has been done solely, primarily after, as Richard Grove suggests, 17th century onward. That is the period when Europe started geographical discoveries, started expanding. In that expansion, they encountered various new kind of formations, social formations, geographical formations, flora, fauna. So, these new unfamiliar landscapes, unfamiliar flora, unfamiliar fauna, all these led to a kind of inquiry into the nature of these things. That inquiry gives us primarily tool through which we have been examining environmental history. I am not suggesting that period before 17th century cannot be examined in terms of environmental history. We have been doing that also, and in for forthcoming lectures I will be discussing that also. But at the moment, let me argue that environment as a factor emerged as a historical concern somewhere 17th century. I am nowhere suggesting that environment was not taken care by, was not understood by, was not conceptualized by societies of past. They have been. But it was so all pervasive that nobody really took care of significance of these factors. They have been influencing that. They were there, they were playing their own role, and humans were aware of these factors. I am not denying that. And we will examine the environmental history of medieval and ancient India later on, then I will elaborate on that. What I am trying to suggest that in the discipline of history, in the discipline of inquiry per se, environment becomes an important consideration 17th century onward. Please remember, agriculture was important consideration since agriculture began. Agriculture related production process were considerations of those who were acting on human past. But environment as a category, environment as a concern, environment as a factor which is treated as responsible for changes, which is treated as responsible for human adaptations, emerged only during this period when Europeans encountered a different kind of landscape, different kind of flora, different kind of fauna. These discoveries on the one hand led to discovery of new world. America was discovered, both the South and North America was discovered. It was not, it's not that it was there, but it was not discovered by the Europeans and the Asians. For them it was a discovery that they have discovered new world. This interaction with a new world, which means interaction with a new kind of geographical formation, a new kind of vegetation, a new kind of fauna which is available in that country. And in what ways it is different from? It is different from the mainland Europe, it is different from mainland of Asia, which means the difference made it all the more apparent that look, this is a different formation, yet it has been sustaining human population, it is sustaining human settlements, which means there are different kind of negotiations. When they examined, when they realized, observed and later on examined the variety of agriculture which is practiced in that area and non-availability of those products in their backyard, which means environment is not equal, uniform, similar for everybody. There were changes, and these changes were important for historian to understand. What do you mean by that? Different kind of agriculture, different kind of method of agriculture. This is different from what we see in Europe, what we see in Asia, which means they were able to identify the difference and yet the basic character of production in terms of flora and fauna. So, these differences made them realize, look, environment has been playing an important role, and that important role needs to be examined, and that examination was not in terms of environmental history as we understand today. It was basically in terms of historical geography. Let me elaborate that. You will become much more. It will become much more clearer. Decline of Indus Valley civilization. What led to that? Who was responsible for that? Please remember, Harappan civilization was discovered only in the 20th century, somewhere 1920s, not before that. Before that, Indian history began with the coming of Aryans, with the Aryans. There was no past prior to that. It was with the discovery of Harappan civilization that we took back our Indian history to Harappan period. What led to decline of that Harappan civilization? Is it human conflict or environment played an important role? That consideration, that environment might have played an important role, is concern of environmental history. Why? That played an important role. Similarly, the decline of Mesopotamian civilization in Iran, Iraq. Why it declined? So, those who encountered it initially, Europeans as well as outsiders, they posed this question: what led to decline of these massive urban settlements? How are we going to explain it? How are we going to explain the sheer fact that these settlements have been abandoned by human civilization? Is it not feasible to live on these urban settlements now? Why is it not feasible? What has changed? That change is change in environment, and that is what environmental historians were trying to examine. So, those early historical geographers, they tried to examine in terms of geographical factors. Later on, it took shape in terms of environmental history. That diversity also enabled humans to understand that different kind of negotiations have been taking place with environment, which means all the humans does not have similar environment. There is tropic, there is arid climate, then there is a tundra. All these varieties have sustained different kind of humans, which means environment has been influencing their understanding, their negotiations, and that negotiations needs to be documented for comprehensive understanding of diversity of human existence. The way we understand that it is very important to document and preserve biodiversity. Similarly, it is important to document and preserve various kind of negotiations, various diverse kind of negotiations with the environment by diverse kind of human settlements, because that diversity will take care of any future change which we might witness in coming years or later on. Similarly, the documentation of flora and fauna. Elephant was not to be seen in the northern Europe. It is not an animal of that area. Such a massive mammoth, it was called mammoth. Elephant was called mammoth. The kind of vegetation which is visible and the kind of climate they have, it was not possible to sustain a large mammal like and vegetarian mammal. Elephant is a vegetarian mammal. They have bear, but bear eats fish and flesh, whereas elephant does not. So, elephant can be sustained only in a region which has a good forest cover, which has good flora, which has good vegetation. So, for Europeans, it was an amazing sight to witness elephant. Now, they raise question, why elephants are not in their own country, why they are not on their own continent. When they examined these questions, they were grappling with the questions of environment, and that influenced, that shaped environmental history of future times. These historical geographers were trying to examine in terms of the role played by geography in evolution, decline and continuation of various kind of settlements. So, in a way, they were documenting those processes which are now being used by environmental history to further nuance that. Decline, continuation, survival, humans were playing their own role, but what was the role of flora and fauna? The decline in one kind of flora or decline in one kind of fauna, how that has been influencing human negotiation. It's not only geography per se, geographical landscape is there, but what kind of vegetation it can sustain, what kind of fauna can it sustain, and how all these is being used, adapted to by the humans for a longer continuation of civilization in that area. Let me give you another example. During Roman period, the roads were there, but later on we witnessed decline of road and chariots. It was replaced by camels on one hand and bullocks, horses, etc., etc. But primarily it was taken care by camel. Richard Bullitt has written a very classic book on that. That how wheel was replaced by camel. Constructing road was a very expensive proposition. The moment Roman Empire stopped expansion and import of slaves, it was difficult for them to construct roads and maintain roads. If roads are not there, then it is very difficult for you to run your chariot. It is much economical, much advisable to use pack animals. It can be camel, it can be horse, it can be bullock, it can be donkey, etc., etc. How fauna has been influencing that, that is very important. Let me give you another example. I will be dealing this with later on as well. When Mughals came to India, they were basically horse oriented, as the cavalry was their major strength. But as they moved towards east, from west they came, Western Asia, Western India, and as they moved towards east, towards more humid area, towards more flood prone area, they shifted to elephant. In the paintings, it has been very clearly depicted, early paintings depict Mughal might on horse. Later on, Mughal might is depicted on elephant. They very soon realized that it is impossible to rely on horses if you are venturing into an area which is basically flood prone. If you want to capture Bengal, if you want to capture Assam, you need to shift your forces from cavalry to elephantry. Availability of that fauna, availability of that animal enabled Mughals to conquer that area and control that area. It was impossible for horses to carry their cannons, impossible for the bullocks to carry their canyons in the humid parts of Bihar and Bengal. It was the elephant which could take care of that, which means human negotiations are not only influenced by geography only, but the flora and fauna has also been playing very important role. Let me cite you another classic example. As a peasant, as a kisan, when there is a failure of rain, when we say that the rain is declining, is not coming at proper time, we have evidence from 17th century which says that peasant says, if I cannot sow, if I cannot go for wheat, if I cannot go for rice, let me go for moat. It has a very short gestation period, very short ripening period. So if rain is delayed, I will shift from other crops to moat, and it is very hardy crop. It can sustain in more very arid conditions as well. Availability of moat at times sustained human population in the arid parts of Rajasthan, which means the flora has been used by humans to sustain themselves in changed conditions, change within one season. If it is a good monsoon, timely monsoon, you will be going for rice and things like that. But if it is delayed, if it is insufficient, you move to moat. So various kind of flora is being used by the societies. These documentations are important for environmental historians, because through these we can examine the inability of certain societies to adapt to changes and the possibilities of adaptation for future changes in the environment. What Richard Grove has also suggested when he said that 17th, 18th century is an important period for beginning of environmental history, then he was also arguing in terms of industrial revolution, Later on, much later, that is 17th, 18th century, much later, around 1950s, the process of decolonization, nuclear holocaust, industrial pollution and populist movement, product of democracy emerging in various parts of globe. Which means the environmental history on the one hand has been influenced by historical geographers who were part of European expansion, who were part of that geographical discoveries which were taking place in 16th, 17th centuries, and later on how that led to beginning of industrial revolution and its ill effect on various parts of globe. One kind of human negotiation in one kind of environmental conditions, when the same terms were imposed on different environmental conditions, things went to problem. And those problems have been considerations of environmental historians. Richard Grove suggests that environmental history as we understand today was greatly influenced by, on the one hand, 17th, 18th century geographical explorations, industrial revolution, colonial exploitation, and then later on decolonization, nuclear holocaust, industrial pollution, etc., etc. Which means to understand environmental history, we must understand that the present form has emerged. The present form has emerged primarily in an era when different kind of negotiations with environment were being documented. And these changes were visible in the way humans were exploiting their natural resources. Let me elaborate that for a couple of minutes, then I will move forward to examine how environmentalism has been also playing important role in the shape, in the way environmental history has shaped. Industrial revolution is basically, just for the summary's sake, it's a very general argument, I am suggesting that we move from biotic source of energy to abiotic sources of energy. What I mean by that? Prior to that, the energy sources were basically biotic, human energy, animal energy and vegetation. But during industrial revolution, we shifted to abiotic source of energy, primarily fossil fuels. Any kind of biotic energy, humans or animals, has a limitation to work. It is impossible for humans to work 24 hours. We require sleep. Similarly, it is impossible for animals to work continuously for 24 hours. They require sleep. If that is the case, then the coming of fossil fuel liberated this restriction. Now, the machine can work continuously 24 hours, 7 days a week, and if machine is working, it requires sources of energy. If it is running, it also requires raw material. If raw material is provided, it is producing goods, so you require market. A devastating chain of natural resources exploitation has started, which in today's time we term it as consumerism. Globalization and consumerism is product of this phase. So Richard Grove is suggesting that this is the phase which is very important for us to examine when we are examining the nature, the way environmental history has emerged later on. Who have been documenting this is basically naturalists, medical officers, administrators, botanists, who were part of colonial administration. They came with the colonial power. Initially traders, the European traders, later on when they established their colonies, so they were part of colonial administration. They were documenting various kind of landscapes, various kinds of flora, fauna, and those documents are very important for us because those documents provide us a landmark picture that this was the conditions during this period of time, and now we can examine the change which has taken place since that. So they become very important. So environmental historians have been relying on these primary documentations to examine any kind of adverse or positive change on environment later on. This is also important when we say or when we argue that this was the period which also led to a kind of ecological imperialism. I will elaborate that later on, but let me complete what I am written here so that it will be easy for it. At another level, Grove suggests green imperialism. Crosby suggests ecological imperialism, Grove is suggesting green imperialism. Both of them treat colonialism or imperialism as an important factor in exploitation of natural resources, that is nature. Such an understanding has also influenced environmental history of India that we will deal later on. Let me briefly elaborate ecological imperialism and green imperialism. The kind of uniformity which we see today, that uniformity is primarily product of ecological imperialism. One kind of taste across globe, one kind of food, one kind of food habits, one kind of drink, all this is a kind of ecological imperialism. A spread of different crops of different continent in various other parts is also a kind of ecological imperialism. Introduction of cotton in those areas where cotton was not produced, import of tobacco, import of tea, import of chili, import of potato, all this from America is influence, is extension of ecological imperialism. So much so that in 1840s when Ireland witnessed massive famine, it was known as potato famine, and potato was not available in Europe prior to colonial expansion to America. Such has been a spread of these ecological imperialism. Green imperialism is another way of arguing the same thing, how various kind of vegetation has been spreading in across continents, and that has been creating a different kind of regime of flora and fauna. Introduction of certain kind of vegetation which is not indigenous to this region might be termed as weed. That weed is problem for various kind of ecological considerations. So, this kind of overlap basically initiated by human agency. I am not saying that it was not taking place earlier, the birds were important carrier, but the speed has accelerated with the human agency. So, that is important consideration for environmental historians. However, before we move to environmental history per se of India in particular, it is important to understand that environmentalism has played an important role in shaping the contours of environmental history. And what I mean by environmentalism is concern for environment. Three important strands of environmentalism needs to be outlined for a better comprehension of tone, tenor and direction of environmental history globally and India in particularly. Three trends, one is back to land, second is scientific conservation, and third is wilderness idea. Let me begin with back to land. With ever increasing industrialization and industrial revolution, you can't imagine the kind of conditions in which working class of England was living in 18th, 19th century. It was pathetic, pathetic, literally pathetic. Industrial pollution was immense. Democracy was not there, so there was no possibility of protection of democratic rights of these workers against the exploitative class of capitalists. So, the industrial revolution had changed the landscape of urban settlements. Earlier, the richer section migrated to urban settlements to settle, but with the industrial revolution and its pollutants, it was impossible for them to live in the industrial town. So, they went back to, that is termed as back to land. They were aspiring for that pristine land, that agrarian landscape. So much so, the romantic poets like Blake and Wordsworth were writing about nature and the natural descriptions. That it was very good outside there, back it was very good, earlier it was very good, unlike the present industrial society. So, this has been documented in novels as well. Charles Dickens has been as important consideration for us when we examine romantic idea of back to land. Soon, people could realize that we cannot do away with industrial revolution and its benefits or its problems. So, we need to evolve certain kind of tools through which we can conserve as much as possible, a kind of middle path between industrial exploitation and conservation of traditional societies. So, that is scientific conservation, and it basically took place in area of forestry. The forests were being eliminated, being cut, deforestation was taking place, and how forestry is to be reintroduced. But what they could not understand, that scientific forestry led to monocropping, cultivation of one particular kind of forest. So, the diversity which was available in the natural forest is lost forever. So, scientific conservation had its own limitations. So, it also led to another kind of movement which is basically termed as wilderness idea, and it took shape primarily in North America. They suggest in their continent it is still possible to protect untouched areas where industrial revolution has not yet impacted. We must protect that, we must conserve that. So, at least we have an area which is protected, which is preserved as it existed before, as it existed prior to introduction of industrial tools and industrial exploitations. This wilderness area also led to establishment of national parks. Please remember, initially these efforts were individual centric. The groups were pooling their resources and they were purchasing land so that no human intervention can take place in those areas, and the pristine nature is protected. The famous Yosemite National Park and the Yellowstone National Parks are basically part of that effort. Later on, government could realize, no, it is important to preserve that, conserve that, so they also converted them into national parks. What I am trying to suggest is negotiations with environment as understood by society has also been influencing the nature of environmental history. Simply because those who were participating in these kind of movements back to land or scientific conservation or wilderness idea were writing about environmental history. What has changed, how it should be reserved, how it can be reversed, why it is important to reverse it, or how in what measures we can protect it. All these is being written by those who were part of either of these, which means it was the environmentalists who were basically documenting changes to environment and negotiations of humans with those changes. Primary area of concerns of environmental history. Yeah, do you have anything?
Thank you so much, sir, for in fact introducing us to this new field and giving us a very interesting introduction. And pertaining to that, sir, considering it is a new discipline, I'd like to ask you, what is the significance of this for either for a layman or a student from that perspective?
I agree. It's an important question, simply because it's an emerging field. It is grappling with these questions, no doubt. We are grappling with this question, what is the significance of environmental history? Let me give you an example, perhaps things will become clearer to you. Today, with the present government's stress on Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Betis have been important for human societies, but we were not able to realize their significance in the growth, in the sustenance of present day civilizations. Similarly, environment as a factor was placed at the back. Historians particularly were not understanding that environment has been influencing the shape of human settlements. It became all the more important when we started examining or understanding the impact of industrial revolution and later on climate change. Both these, industrial revolution in the beginning and later on climatic change, both these made us realize that though environment can be examined in local terms, but it has a global connections. So environmental history attains significance simply because while examining a locality, we are locating in terms of wider global context. In what ways these settlements give us lesson of negotiations of adaptations on one hand, and on the other hand, in what ways these can be beneficial for other regions. What we can learn from these adaptation for other region, or the other regions have lessons too for this region. This is one part. The second and important part is environment doesn't have voice. This is voiceless. It's very important. Everybody knows that it's very important, but we need to give voice to it. We need to put them on platter. Look, this is very important factor. We have been neglecting that. Since it doesn't have voice, does not mean it is not playing an important role. So we are bringing back environment on the center stage simply to suggest that the present day global context needs focused studies of environmental histories.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering that in a very explicit manner for us so that it becomes even clearer, giving us suitable examples. Sir, very briefly, just to squeeze in a question because we have less time available, the idea of environmentalism and how has that been influencing environmental history?
Yes, important question. Yes, Urvashi, I will be elaborating that in my next lecture as well. What I am suggesting that the way I was, my previous answer is suggested that environment doesn't have voice. Who is going to give voice to it? Those who are concerned for it. What kind of concerns? As a capitalist, I am interested in exploitation of natural resources because that maximizes my profit. As a labor, my concern is give me my bread, give me my salary. I'm satisfied with that. So we need a section of population who is arguing for environment. Fortunately or unfortunately, it is the environmentalists who have been arguing that. Initially, they were arguing the displacement caused by mega projects, how that has been influencing the humans, or elimination of one kind of resources for a particular society. So the environment was usually seen in terms of its utility. Sooner, the environmentalists realized that apart from human utility, environment has its own identity, its own existence, its own importance. And when they started arguing that, primarily in terms of human concerns, human and natural resources, but that gave us a platform on which we can further examine intricacies involved in human negotiations with environment and things like that.
Right, right. Sir, just very quickly, who are exactly these people arguing for environment? Could we talk of just environment groups, or is it also coming from the side of students or another, say, said?
Urvashi, at the moment, it is coming from every quarter of society. Every quarter of society, be citizen of an urban area or rural area or mountain or ocean dwellers, everybody has realized the importance of environment.
Right.
And the way it has been taught in our curriculum in schools, now environment has attained greater significance. But how we are going to deal with it, that is the important question. If we are focusing on humans only, or are we going to give primacy to environment and environmental factors for examination of these larger processes?
Right.
That is where I place it.
Right. Thank you so much. And just to let you know, viewers, tomorrow shall be a continuation of today's lecture. We shall have more on the introduction of environmental history, from where we'll take up and proceed further. So friends, let us thank sir for being associated with us. Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for sparing your valuable time.
If we have a minute, then please display this bibliography as well, because this will be useful for the viewers.
Just very quickly, if we could show the bibliography on the slide, and then we could just wrap up the lecture. Yes, please.
These are important writings, and the first article summarizes the writings of others as well. So it will be important. It's a very small article, easily available on net. You can use that, and then there are specialist books which are dealing with the nature of environmental history per se.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you friends for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.